Greetings, I'm Tom Nelson, and orchids have had a special allure, an exotic allure for many centuries to people, and orchid explorers risked life and limb in the old days to find rare species, and a lot of people don't realize that there were 36 species of orchids right here on Long Island historically, and 26 of those are still extant. And I first became interested in orchids in around 2005, I should say, obsessed with native orchids. I'd always liked them as a youth, and it's a long story, but I became a professional jazz pianist and did not pursue botany as a career. Now I'm sort of later in life having a dual career, which is very enjoyable. And in 2007, I was lucky enough to meet Eric Lamont. Paul Martin Brown, the well-known orchid researcher, when I was having a hard time finding an orchid species, Tipularla, here on Long Island, Paul Brown said, "You should contact Eric Lamont." And I did, and as they say, the rest is history. We've been collaborating since that time, taking many field trips together, and we're lucky enough to get the opportunity to write a book together in 2012. And all the information in today's presentation can be found in that book, which is available after the presentation if someone is so interested. And I want to talk for a minute about the orchid flower, a little bit of the biology of the orchid. The orchid flower is unique. It's evolved as to lure the pollinators into the flower to achieve pollination. And the flower is formed in groups of 3, with 3 petals and 3 sepals, and the lip petal. Let's see. This is the lip here. Is evolved as a landing pad for the pollinator, and here's the lip petal. It's just evolved into a fantastically shaped apparatus to try to lure the insect in to find they think there's nectar in there, but most orchids do not have nectar, so it's a false trail. And but it sure is pretty. And the real fascinating things about orchids and what makes them oftentimes so rare is that they have to have a symbiotic relationship with a root fungus, a mushroom, and it's impossible for them to grow. Every orchid species has to have this symbiotic mycorrhizal relationship with a fungus, or the seed will not germinate because the seeds do not contain the endosperm. They have no food contained, just the genetic material. So it has to land in just the right place where the fungus is growing. And here's a picture of the fungal hyphae penetrating the orchid seed. And some mycologists believe that the orchids parasitize their beloved mushrooms. The jury's still out on that. It's believed to truly be a symbiotic relationship. Research is still being done on that. But this is why, if anyone should try to transplant an orchid, which is strictly forbidden, they would find it's hard to grow in their garden because they would have to have the fungus growing there as well. And as you know, you cannot transplant a mushroom very successfully. And just a note on the photography, I did almost all the photographs in this presentation are mine, and I still work with film because I like the way the colors look. And I really believe that the simpler the mechanism on the camera, the better. I just have a basic single lens reflex Pentax camera that's 20 years old. And as the great landscape photographer Ansel Adams said, a good picture is not a picture of the object, it's a picture of the light on the object. So to achieve the proper lighting and contrast, there are a variety of methods. Flash is the easiest. This is a ring flash, goes right on the lens, and makes for great close-ups, and you don't have to, you have a tripod because you can shoot at 60th of a second, and then you want to have reflectors and diffusion umbrellas. This is a colony of Calypso, which is quite a find, and to not have glaring light. A black background is great to give definition, and this is a diffusion tent which cuts down wind and makes for, I put the black background in there on my own. So that's basically, my approach to photography over the years has developed into those factors. So without further ado, I would like to ask Eric up to go over the species of Long Island, the orchid species of Long Island. Thank you.
So we're just going to get right to it. And as Tom mentioned, there's 36 species recorded from Long Island historically, and I'm going to go over each of those in 40 minutes. I'm going to try at least. And as he mentioned, 26 species are still extant, although some of them are just barely holding on. I'm going to start with the cranefly orchid in the genus Tipularla, and the individual flowers resemble craneflies, which are in the genus Tipula. Here we have the seed pods, and here we have a leaf, or several leaves, and you notice they're purple on the underside. And here's the whole plant. The only current population of this right now is this one right here that we know of, out in Greenport. Historically, there was another population in Montauk, which there's still very good habitat, and the plants still may be there. I'll just also mention that this is a southern species, which is pretty much at its northern limit of its range on Long Island. There's one little population on Martha's Vineyard, which is just barely holding on. Now, the reason I started with Tipularla is because I'm going to be giving you a lot of information about Long Island orchids, and the question might be asked, where does all this information come from? So we do have a very healthy written record in publications and private journals of some Long Island naturalists of Long Island orchids. Another really good source is herbarium specimens. And so what I did several years ago was I visited all the major herbaria in not only the New York area, but I went up to Harvard, and I went to Cornell and Albany and Philadelphia to and I looked at thousands of specimens, collections of orchids from Long Island. And a lot of times on the sheets, there's little annotations, there's little notes from the collector. So I just thought I would use Tipularla as just one example to kind of tell you how we get a lot of this information. So Tipularla was first found by Roy Latham in Moore's Woods, and this is from a publication in 1910, actually by Charles Peck, who was the state botanist at the time. And in that little note that was published, it records a colony of about 30 plants. In 1914, Stuart Burnham, who then became the state botanist, and Roy Latham, published the flora of the town of Southold. And in that, they have another little note that says that they went back and there was a forest fire that had gone through through Moore's Woods, and they thought it destroyed the colony. So 4 years after it was found, they thought it was gone. I also just want to mention that orchid locations, we don't usually share them in specific detail. We usually just give county or township. But notice here, I mean, right away we said Moore's Woods in Greenport, and oh no, people can go out and dig up these last plants. But let me tell you, it's very difficult to find. And also, I'm not hesitant to share this information because it's already out there if anyone wants to look it up. So after 1914, though, 4 years later, Roy Latham collected plants. These are collections in 1918, 1919, and 1920. So the population was not destroyed. And once again, I'm just trying to tell you how we know about this information I'll be talking about today. In 1926, then, Latham published twice his finding of Tipularla in Montauk. And it's interesting because he found one colony in 1926, and then he went back the next year, 1927, found a second colony, and in 1928 found a third colony, 3 separate colonies out in Montauk with 81 plants in total. So we've been looking for that for many years, and we haven't found it yet. So then there's collections of Tipularla from Greenport again in all these years. In 1971, Roy Latham published another note on Tipularla, and he said there were approximately 70 plants. In 1987, we had a new generation of botanists, and we counted 250 flowers. Oh, no, these are leaves, with 66 flowers. And that was a conservative count. And then from 2000 to 2014, we've usually been finding around 60 leaves. Not much flowering, though, occurring. So anyhow, I just kind of started out with this to let you know how we know the information that we're going to be presenting today. So we're going to move on now to Arethusa, the dragon's mouth orchid. And I don't know, it speaks for itself. It's just a simply beautiful, amazing orchid. There's a lot of descriptions about this orchid. It's like a fiery dragon emerging from some prehistoric swamp. I love those stories. So let's just talk a little bit about Arethusa. In 1923, Norman Taylor from Brooklyn Botanic Garden at the time published a monograph on the grasslands of Montauk, and he said in the boggy areas of Montauk, about the end of May, this part of the peninsula is aflame with Arethusa bulbosa. Going back earlier, in 1877, Miller, who published the first flora of Suffolk County, wrote this: I find Arethusa growing in great abundance in the swamp adjoining Hook Pond in the village of East Hampton. I gathered several hundred specimens in a very small part of the swamp. No one need have any fear of destroying that locality by collecting specimens. Well, the swamp's still there, Hook Pond is still there, and there's a little swamp still. No one's ever seen Arethusa there. It's been extirpated from that site for who knows how many years. I'll also mention that Roy Latham published a note that Arethusa is abundant. This was in 1940, he wrote, in the western part of Long Island still. So here's Arethusa, and here's our map. Let me just mention something about the map. All these dots are based upon herbarium collections, which doesn't mean that this is everything. We're going to see some other species I'll talk about with some sites that we know of that are not marked with dots because they're not herbarium specimens, and we don't collect orchids. But there were over 24 colonies or populations of Arethusa known on Long Island historically, and this goes back to the 1800s. And currently, there's only one little colony. It was recently surveyed by Vicky Bustamante, who found 6 plants there last year, and that's it for Long Island. But it's not just Long Island where this plant has declined. It's throughout its range, and there's multiple causes of its decline. Probably habitat destruction. It prefers wetlands, and just very slight changes in the water hydrology will cause this species to not be able to survive there anymore. So we'll move on to grass pink, Calopogon. You can see here from the map, it's another, historically one of the more common species on Long Island, and it still is to this day. But all these populations are extirpated. It's still fairly common out on the east end of the South Fork and other places here and there. But at one time, I calculated what percentage of this species, of the populations, have been lost, and it was about 70% of these no longer occur. I'll also just mention that when Tom and I collaborated together on the book, one of the things I wanted to include were the seed pods of the orchids, because they're good diagnostic characters for identifying species, like after they're no longer in flower. And actually, our book is the first book to include photographs of the species with seed pods. Okay, I learned this is the frog orchid, but it's called the long-bracted orchid. It's been placed in several genera. Here it's in Coeloglossum, but it's been placed in various other genera. Very rare, and there's no known populations of this anymore on Long Island. Okay, now we come to the coral roots, which is a fairly large genus. We do have several species on Long Island. This is the spotted coral root, Coralla maculata. And so let's see. I've seen this out here at Montauk a number of years ago, and it's been reported from near Connecticut River State Park. So see, there's no dot there because there's no specimen. This whole genus is a kind of, it doesn't need sunlight. It has no chlorophyll. I mean, it may have a little, but not enough to sustain itself. And so this plant very often will remain hidden underground for years. I mean, 20 years. You won't see it. And then all of a sudden it'll pop up one year, and then it disappears again for a number of years. And that's not uncommon with orchids. So this one is still extant on Long Island, and it's probably around here and there. It's just you have to be in the right place at the right time to find it. Although I wouldn't be surprised in northern Nassau County here if it might pop up now and then, because the habitat is still available for it. Here's the autumn coral root, and you can see it's been collected, you know, here and there on Long Island. And currently, though, there's one population right around here that we know of. So once again, there's no herbarium specimen for it. See, this is from a publication, and which was only based on collections. So we do know of a population. We're monitoring it. Probably at least 10 years, and it's not the showiest orchid. The flowers don't really open up. That's about what they kind of look like. There's another form of it, which the flower variety, Fringed, which has more pretty flowers. Okay, so now we come to the genus Cypripedium, the lady slipper orchid, and probably most of us that know orchids in the field are familiar with this species. And you can see from the map, it is probably the most common species on Long Island, but just in the last 30-some years that I've been studying Long Island orchids, I've just seen such a decline in these. I mean, even in Nassau County, they used to be all over the place. I was teaching outdoor and environmental education in the 1970s in Nassau County, and there was a site we used to bring students to, and there were lots of pink lady slippers there. And when they'd go back onto their bus to go back home at the end of the day, you know, there'd be parents there to supervise, and some of the parents would have little bouquets of lady slipper orchids, and some of them would just be on the pavement, and it was, you know, horrible to see. But probably a major cause for its decline is deer browse. You can see that it comes in very many different colors. It's usually pink, but it can be very dark. And there's a pure white form that occurs on Long Island, and we've seen it several places here. And I just wanted to say something about the pink lady slipper, something that, in addition, because sometimes you have the tendency to kind of take this species for granted. You say, oh yeah, it's a pink lady slipper, I've seen those. But if you really just look at them, I mean, look at this flower. I mean, look at the lip. I mean, that's a petal. a petal. I just have to say, I've been botanizing in Europe with some British friends for the last 5 years, and not only me, but probably everyone in here, we have the tendency to say petals. They're not petals that we, use to ride our bicycles. They're petals. I've been corrected many times. And the yellow lady slipper, which is Tom's favorite. I've been in the field with Tom a lot. I mean, we've gone all the way around the Great Lakes and down the Smoky Mountains and everywhere in between. This is his favorite flower. And probably after maybe several thousand photographs I've watched him take, I said, don't you have enough photographs of yellow lady slippers? No. It's the Holy Grail. But surprisingly, Long Island is really, it's not the habitat for the species. I mean, first of all, they usually like limestone, calcium-type soils. But back in the 100, 150 years ago, there were several populations in Brooklyn and Queens, which, they haven't been reported there in more than 100 years. So now we come to the one non-native species, the one introduced species of orchid on Long Island, Epipactis helleborine, which was first discovered up in Syracuse. I used to know the date. 1870? Ish. Okay. And there's been many studies that have documented the spread of this species, first in New England, and, New York, New England, and now it just goes from coast to coast. It goes with the coyotes, the coyotes. Hey, maybe that's how those seeds are getting spread around. But you know what's interesting? The first time this plant was collected on Long Island was in Greenport by Roy Latham in 1960. Now, somewhere else, Roy Latham published that this is what he's saying, or said, that he had brought over 100 botanists to Moore's Woods to see the Tipularla there during his lifetime. He lived 98 years. And I just kind of think that a lot of the people that would come all the way to see the cranefly orchid might have been in other orchid sites a day or two before on their way to Long Island to see the cranefly orchid, and they might have had a few seeds on their shoes or plants. How else did it just appear there? I mean, in such an orchid, rich area as Moore's Woods. So anyhow, that's how I just think it might have initially become introduced on Long Island, but that's just pure speculation. It's an interesting flower. It's a huge genus in Europe with well over 50 species. And we have other species in the United States. In the West, we have Epipactis. Was it Gigantea? Gigantea. And so, I mean, I could talk about each one of these species. I could do a whole talk just on each one. So but I have to cover 36 species here. But very often people will ask, is this considered invasive? Or does this species pose threats to our native species? And just recently, Dr. Eric Morgan from Farmingdale State College, I'm not sure of the exact name of how you say that university, and he's currently the president of the Torrey Botanical Society. They've been studying this species, and they have found, and he's explained it to me like twice. And the one time Tom was there, and it's very recent, just like 2 weeks ago. And I'll have to leave it to Eric Morgan to explain. But they're finding that there's some insect that this species is interfering with. I don't know if it's a pollinator, but anyhow, so the answer is yes. Only very recently is there evidence that this is having a negative impact upon our native orchids. Okay, the showy orchid, Galliaris. very rare. Only one, actually there's a second report, but there's no herbarium specimen. There was another one, I think, from Queens. But this was interesting. There's a whole story about this population because it was first found on a field trip of the Torrey Botanical Society, and they didn't even know it was there. They went on a field trip, and this is, I think it's in the late 1800s, and all this information's in our books, that's why I don't have to remember it. But they went on a field trip here, and they didn't know this species was there, and they unexpectedly found it, and it was like the first occurrence of it on Long Island. It does occur in New Jersey, historically Staten Island. Off of Long Island, it's not really uncommon, but it hasn't been seen on Long Island for many, many years. Okay, now we come to the genus Goodyera, the rattlesnake plantains, and these orchids are probably known best for their leaf venation and color. I mean, those are really spectacular looking leaves. The flowers are orchid flowers, but really it's the leaves that most people look at, I think, in the field. You don't look at the flowers that carefully. But here's another example now of a species that was fairly common on Long Island and has declined drastically, even just in the years I've been studying them. And we really don't know why. I mean, in other cases, we have good ideas with Arethusa, where the hydrology has changed. But this one is, I don't know. I mean, orchids are very fickle to begin with. So it is declining. I mean, all of these, there's one population known in Nassau County. And, out east there are several, but it is declining. And two other species of Goodyera that have been recorded from Long Island, Goodyera repens and Goodyera tessellata. And neither of those have been observed for many years. So we consider these extirpated. Okay, Isotria. Isotria. We have two species historically. This is a federally listed species. And once again, there's an interesting story here. It's been collected twice on Long Island. It's been collected several times in New York State, throughout New York State. But before maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it hadn't been seen in New York State in years. I don't know how many, 10, 15 years. And just recently, it has been rediscovered, or a new population's been found upstate New York. So one occurrence in all of New York State. So that's rare. It's rare throughout its entire range. So in 1918, Fanny Mulford collected Isotria medialoides near, I guess it's either Hempstead Lake or Valley Stream, somewhere around there. And then in 1923, William Ferguson found 2 more plants in the West Hills area. And so I've looked at the herbarium specimens at the New York Botanical Garden, and there's one of those little notes on it. And William Ferguson wrote, "Found 2 plants, collected them both." And that's the last time it's been seen on Long Island. However, the habitat is still good, and we've looked for it. And as a matter of fact, when Dick Mitchell was the state botanist in New York, he came down with several other botanists, and there was a group of, I don't know, there were maybe 6 or 8 of us, and we were really looking for this species because this very rare, this federally rare species co-occurs with Isotria verticillata. This one here, just look at this one for a second. That I just never get tired of looking. Look at these petals here. This is the lip, one of the petals, It looks like an insect or an alien we were talking about before. But anyhow, so what we did is we went back to this area around in here where the rare isotria was last known to occur that was collected by William Ferguson. And during the course of one day, I mean, it was a long day, we surveyed all the sites of this more common species, and we found 20,000 individuals. And a couple times we were saying, because the two are very similar when they're not in flower. And, you know, a couple times I said, oh, look at this one here, because there's differences in the stem. The one is like pale green, the other one's dark green. But we didn't find the rare one. But, you know, 20,000 individuals, that's not bad. However, you know, all these populations are no longer occur. Even the ones out east have declined for various reasons. But it's at least doing well in this area here. And Tom put all these photos of Tom's, most all of them. Actually, this one I don't think he has seen in flower yet. So this is from our friend Jim Fowler, who published a book on the orchids of South Carolina. But we put this one in because rarely will you be able to photograph two orchids like this. This is not, it's not staged. It's not, what's the program you use? It's not Photoshop. This is live. This is real. But, you know, I just mentioned that it's interesting because when you go to a site and find an orchid species there, you're very likely to find several species there. And it's not uncommon at all, like Moore's Woods. I mean, historically, there were, you know, 3 or 4 species. So they do tend to grow together, and it's probably because of that fungus relationship, that mycorrhizal relationship that they all require. Okay, now we move to the genus Liparis, which are the tway blades. And we have several types of tway blades in 2 different genera. This is the lily leaf tway blade because the leaves look like, you know, certain lilies like Clintonia and things like that. And you could see that at one time, this species, which does prefer rich woodlands, was not uncommon on Long Island, but this species throughout its entire range has just crashed in the last 60 years. There are no known populations of this on Long Island. And even throughout New York State, it's become very rare. Steve Young knows the number. I don't know if there's only one known population, but throughout all of New York State. But it's very rare, and it's considered extirpated on Long Island. But let's just stop for a second and look at this flower. Look at that. This is the lip. These are the lateral petals. Here are the sepals. I mean, it's just such a, I don't know, bizarre flower. And here's its cousin in the same genus, Liparis lucellii. And this is an interesting orchid because, especially on Long Island, its distribution on Long Island is interesting because it's one of these orchids, again, it pops up here and there, now and then you don't see it for a long time. So even though there's no dot, I have seen this out here in like the Walking Dunes area with Jim Ash, who was the one that, actually it was Ann Johnson who told Jim, and then Jim and I went out there. And then I saw it there once, you know, 20-some years ago, and never seen it again. Where the Long Island Expressway crosses over the Carmens River, there was another population there. And here's another interesting story. Anyhow. So this collection here was once again from Fanny Mulford, who was a botanist at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. She collected this species in, I think, the late 1800s, 1896. And then it hadn't been seen again until recently when Dave Taft relocated a population there. So that's like over 100 years it hadn't been seen. The southern tway blade, which is in a different genus, and now they've even put it in another genus, Once again, another kind of bizarre flower. There's a very healthy population of over 1,000 individuals near the Connecticut River. Listera cordata was only collected once. It could be around, but it's unlikely. I don't have a lot of time left, and there's several stories to tell about Malaxis. Currently, there's 2 species that are considered species, and that's a talk in itself, because like when I started botany, I don't know, 35 years ago, no one even knew about the species. But anyhow, that's another story. But it has a look-alike species, Malaxis unifolia, one leaf, here it is, with one known population here. And I did want to just talk a little bit about conservation, what we're doing to protect these orchids. So I'll just mention that, once again, Dave Taft has been involved in a project to basically protect this one known colony. That's the only one we know of. But this orchid, it only grows an inch or 2 tall, so it's probably around. But there's only one we know of, and it's being threatened by roadside mowing. They're just destroying it. We've lost several species from the East End by roadside mowing at inappropriate times of years, and then winter salting of the roads has had a huge impact, negative impact on orchids. Now we come to the prettiest, in my opinion, group, well, one of the prettiest groups of orchids, the white-fringed orchid, well, the genus Platanthera, and this is blephariglottis. And once again, you could see it was fairly common on Long Island. It's still around. We know several populations, but most of them are declining. And I've been involved in a project at Quogue Wildlife Refuge, which is probably right here, because the population was just declining and declining through the years until in the 2000s, there were only like 6 individuals. So we went in, and what was happening was woody vegetation was encroaching on this open marshland. So we went in and we removed woody vegetation over 2 years in the winter. We had DEC permits and the whole thing. And about 2 or 3 years later, the population rebounded, and there were like 200 to 300 individuals. But these types of restoration projects and management projects, they're long-term. You have to keep doing it. So since it's been maybe 10 years, it's back down to like only 10 individuals again, so it needs a lot more management. The yellow-fringed orchid, I mean, these just are so beautiful. Platanthera ciliaris. There's only like 1 population remaining, and it's just barely holding on. And it could be this one population needs management, and it's just, right now, it's just really not happening. The club spur orchid, you can see, this is called the spur, and this species, at the end of it, it's clavate, like a baseball bat. It kind of gets wider at the tip. So that's how it gets its name. This one's still around. It's one of the more common ones. Cristata, though, is very rare. And once again, I'm running out of time, but there's a lot to... 1 minute. Well, anyhow, this is another species that is at its northern limit of its range. There was 1 colony up in Massachusetts, which is probably, it's not doing very well, and it's not doing very well on Long Island. Platanthera pallida is a whole story in itself, because it was a recently described species in the 1990s by Paul Martin Brown. But since then, I think pretty much everyone, except for Paul, considers it just a variation of the last species, Platanthera cristata. There are differences, like if you look at the lip, this lip comes out as a landing platform, whereas this lip is really kind of bent backwards. The color's different, and there's some other differences. And I'm done, almost. Dilatata could occur. There's a whole story about this one. This one's really nice. This one's very rare. Psychotes I had seen in Montauk many years ago, but it's considered extirpated. Begonia is common. And now we come to the genus Spiranthes, and they're very difficult to identify, and I think we'll end with that.
All right.
Or else I'm going to get beat up.
Thank you.